The delicate scent of polished mahogany and imported silk floated through the air of Maison Orchid, the most exclusive boutique on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, California. The soft afternoon light cascaded over the immaculate mannequins, reflecting off the pristine marble floor that mirrored every deliberate footstep like still water. It was the quiet hour when the most distinguished clients wandered in without any sense of urgency, accustomed to a world that paused exclusively for them. Rachel Vance stood quietly near an interior glass display, observing the serene environment in absolute silence. Nobody in that opulent showroom had the slightest idea who she was, or that this woman of quiet presence was the sole owner of everything her eyes could reach. She cherished these moments, arriving unannounced, to observe how people treated others when they believed no one of importance was watching. For Rachel, true luxury had never been about the price tag, but rather how a person treated someone who had absolutely nothing to offer them in return. Near the polished brass counter, a young saleswoman named Lily Reynolds carefully folded a garment that had just been tried on by a previous client. She worked with an unmistakable delicacy and a profound attention to detail, exhibiting the gestures of someone who genuinely loved her craft, even though her meager salary barely covered her basic living expenses in Los Angeles. Rachel had been watching her for a good while, feeling a profound liking for the young girl. There was something remarkably pure in her manner of service, a natural sweetness that could not be found in any corporate training manual. Lily noticed the quiet woman standing nearby and approached her with a warm, hesitant smile, offering to brew a cup of hot coffee or steep some fresh tea. Rachel smiled softly, her voice smooth and comforting, replying that she was perfectly fine and was merely taking a moment to admire the beautiful collections. It was a brief exchange of human warmth that anchored Rachel's belief in the young woman's character. At that exact moment, the heavy glass doors of the boutique were pushed open with a violent, sudden force. A woman marched into the room with a firm stride, her chin tilted upward and her sharp eyes scanning the elegant showroom as if she possessed the deed to every square inch of the property. A few paces behind her walked a man with a severe, deeply exhausted expression, holding a mobile phone tightly against his ear, carrying the invisible weight of the world on his drooping shoulders. They were Brooke Stone and her husband, Arthur Stone. In this sprawling American metropolis, the name Arthur Stone carried immense weight, signifying towering glass skyscrapers and vast fortunes that shifted with a single stroke of his pen. His real estate empire had constructed half of the modern high-rises dominating the downtown skyline. However, on this particular afternoon, Arthur did not project the aura of a powerful tycoon. He looked like a broken man trapped in a conversation rapidly spiraling toward total disaster. Pacing toward a secluded corner of the showroom, Arthur muttered frantically into the receiver, begging the person on the other end to listen, warning that if the pending agreement was not finalized, his entire empire would collapse. He pleaded for a direct meeting with the elusive owner of the holding company, stating he had been trying relentlessly for weeks to secure just 5 minutes of her time. Standing silently by the display case, Rachel heard every single desperate syllable, and something deep within her chest shifted slightly, like a heavy stone rolling across the bottom of a deep lake. Yet her serene facial expression remained completely unchanged as she continued to watch the scene unfold in absolute silence. Meanwhile, Brooke had already zeroed in on the most exorbitantly priced garments displayed in the center of the showroom. She touched a delicate silk blouse, dropped it carelessly, and tossed a beaded gown haphazardly onto the counter without a shred of respect for the craftsmanship. Lily, eager to provide excellent service, hurried over with a bright, welcoming smile, greeting Brooke warmly and politely inquiring if there was a specific style she was shopping for. Brooke slowly dragged her piercing gaze up and down the young woman's modest uniform, her face contorting into a sneer of pure disgust that required no further explanation. Raising a perfectly arched eyebrow, Brooke loudly questioned if a mere beginner was actually going to attempt to serve her. She dismissively referred to Lily as a child, commanding her to fetch someone who actually understood the high fashion they were peddling. Brooke explicitly stated she had absolutely no intention of purchasing whatever cheap recommendation a novice might suggest. Lily's eyes immediately dropped to the marble floor as a violent tide of humiliation rushed into her cheeks, painting her face bright red. She softly apologized, her voice trembling slightly, and offered to find a senior associate to assist the demanding client. Brooke snapped at the young girl, ordering her not to apologize, but simply to get out of her way, a cruel command that struck the young saleswoman like a shard of sharp ice. Rachel remained perfectly still, observing every agonizing second of the interaction, deciding that it was not quite the right moment to intervene. Lily desperately tried to salvage the situation, retrieving a stunning designer piece with shaking hands, nervously attempting to explain the intricate quality of the hand-stitched tailoring. Brooke barely registered the young woman's words. She huffed loudly, dramatically rolled her eyes toward the ceiling, and sighed with exaggerated annoyance, acting as though receiving service in this boutique was a severe personal insult. Pushing the expensive garments aside, Brooke declared that none of the items were acceptable, and demanded to speak with the person in charge. She loudly proclaimed that it was painfully obvious the current staff lacked the sophistication to cater to her elite tastes. It was in that moment of arrogant dismissal that Brooke's eyes finally landed on Rachel, seeing a woman standing with quiet dignity, radiating an understated elegance that did not need to scream for attention. In Brooke's deeply twisted logic, she immediately assumed this remarkably poised woman must be a high-ranking supervisor, someone possessing far more status than the trembling girl behind the counter. Pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at Rachel, Brooke loudly commanded her to approach, insultingly remarking that Rachel appeared to possess a bit more intelligence than the useless girl she had just dismissed. Rachel met Brooke's aggressive gaze, not issuing an immediate response, but instead studying the angry woman with a profound calmness that should have terrified her. Agitated by the lack of instant obedience, Brooke raised her voice even louder, demanding that Rachel come over and serve her immediately. Rachel slowly walked forward, her presence commanding an invisible, unshakable authority. Rachel approached the counter with a gentle grace, her voice carrying a soothing serenity that felt entirely out of place amidst the hostile tension Brooke had aggressively manufactured. She politely stated she was more than happy to assist, asking the irate woman exactly what she was looking to find. Brooke demanded the presence of a true professional, insisting she wanted to view the exclusive private collection, completely dismissing the beautiful garments hanging on the racks as cheap rags meant for ordinary people. Rachel nodded slowly, her expression completely unreadable, and calmly asked for what grand occasion the client was preparing. Brooke let out a dry, echoing laugh, glancing around the immaculate showroom as if desperately seeking an audience to validate her cruel mockery. Leaning forward slightly, she lowered her voice to a harsh whisper, telling Rachel she lacked the proper social standing to serve her, and commanding her to summon the actual owner of the establishment. The entire showroom seemingly held its collective breath, while Lily clamped her hands over her mouth, tears of sympathetic humiliation welling in her eyes. In the background, Edward, the elderly master tailor who had stepped out of the back workroom due to the commotion, froze completely in the doorway. He had known Rachel for more decades than he cared to count, and he knew exactly who had just been viciously insulted in front of the entire staff. But Rachel did not flinch. There was no sudden flash of rage in her eyes, no defensive tears, no trembling indignation that Brooke so clearly intended to provoke. Instead, a much more unsettling emotion settled over Rachel's features, a deep, almost sorrowful calm of someone who had witnessed far too much of the world's cruelty. Rachel softly murmured that she understood the request, while deep within her chest, a spark of memory and dormant anger quietly ignited. As Brooke continued her arrogant tirade, Rachel analyzed her with a completely different kind of attention, looking far beneath the surface of the expensive designer clothing. She noticed a tiny twitch of the lip, a specific nervous way Brooke bit the inside of her cheek when she thought no one was watching. She observed a rigid tension in Brooke's shoulders, a posture that did not belong to someone born into generational wealth, but rather to someone desperately pretending they belonged. Having learned to read the hidden truths of human behavior during the most brutal years of her own life, Rachel felt a chilling wave of recognition. She had seen that exact face before many years ago in a completely different world during a time when neither of them had a single dollar to their names. But Rachel kept her silence, knowing the moment for revelation had not yet arrived. Politely excusing herself, Rachel promised to retrieve exactly what the difficult client was demanding, prompting Brooke to cross her arms and order her to hurry up because her time was incredibly valuable. Rachel turned and walked with a steady pace toward the private archives, pausing briefly as she passed by the trembling young saleswoman. Lily's eyes were shining with unshed tears, her dignity thoroughly shattered by the public dressing down. Rachel leaned in and whispered softly, commanding the girl never to lower her head in shame, assuring Lily that her perfect grace and respect held a value far greater than the wealthy woman could ever comprehend. Lily looked up profoundly confused as to why this mysterious quiet woman spoke to her with such commanding authority, intertwined with such deep maternal sweetness. When Rachel reached the entrance to the tailoring workshop, Edward stepped out of the shadows, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed outrage. He spoke in a very low whisper, asking Rachel if she wanted him to intervene and physically escort the horrible woman out of the boutique, vehemently stating that absolutely no one possessed the right to speak to Rachel in such a degrading manner. Rachel gently placed a calming hand on the elderly tailor's arm, shaking her head and softly replying that they would do no such thing, noting that the angry woman was completely unaware of her true identity. Edward nodded, acknowledging the truth of the situation, while Rachel cast a brief glance over her shoulder toward the front of the store where Brooke was pacing impatiently. Rachel whispered to Edward that there was a crucial piece of information Brooke did not know, but that Rachel remembered with absolute clarity. Edward furrowed his brow, deeply confused by Rachel's cryptic words, but Rachel did not answer him right away, keeping her eyes locked on Brooke's pacing figure. For a fraction of a second, her legendary serenity shattered completely, and the old tailor witnessed a profound ancient agony, the kind of buried trauma one assumes is dead, until it suddenly resurrects wearing the face of a familiar ghost. Rachel murmured that the angry woman parading around the showroom had not always been known as Brooke Stone. Edward gasped softly as Rachel continued revealing that there was a time long before the expensive clothes and the Beverly Hills attitude when Brooke possessed even less than Rachel did. The old tailor stood speechless in the hallway, absorbing the shocking revelation about the wealthy client currently terrorizing his beloved workplace. Meanwhile, on the other side of the expansive showroom, Arthur Stone finally ended his desperate phone call, his face pale and defeated. He approached his wife, dragging a weary hand down his face, asking Brooke if she was finished with her shopping, and insisting they needed to leave immediately because their financial situation had become catastrophically complicated. Brooke dismissed his panic with a wave of her hand, proudly declaring she was waiting for the private collection to be brought out, and complained bitterly about almost being served by an incompetent novice. Arthur let out a heavy, ragged sigh, possessing absolutely zero energy to engage in her shallow theatrics, while his mind was consumed by the massive real estate deal slipping through his fingers. He begged Brooke to stop causing a scene, to which she snapped back, insisting her behavior was a necessary lesson in basic manners. At that exact moment, Rachel returned from the back corridors of the boutique, not carrying a luxurious gown, but holding a small, discreet, elegant leather portfolio. Moving with deliberate calmness, she placed the leather folder directly onto the polished glass counter in front of Brooke, softly announcing that she had brought exactly what the client needed. Brooke stared at the leather object with deep suspicion, her nose wrinkling in disgust as she sharply questioned what the folder was, reiterating her demand to see clothing, not paperwork. Rachel replied, her voice gaining an undeniable edge of iron authority, that the contents of the folder were the most important things Brooke would ever need to see. Arthur, distracted by the window, slowly turned his head, his attention captured by the commanding cadence of a person who was entirely accustomed to holding absolute power. Deeply annoyed but slightly curious, Brooke flipped open the heavy leather cover of the portfolio, her eyes quickly scanning the very first line of the heavily stamped document. In an instant, the haughty expression vanished completely from her face, all the color drained rapidly from her cheeks, and her lips parted in a silent gasp. The manicured hand holding the edge of the folder began to tremble violently as she whispered in a fragile voice that what she was reading was simply impossible. Arthur stepped closer, his brow furrowed in deep confusion, urgently asking his wife what was wrong and what the document contained that could cause such a reaction. Brooke could not formulate a coherent sentence, slowly lifting her terrified eyes from the legal papers to lock her gaze onto Rachel. There was absolutely no trace of arrogance in Brooke's expression. There was only a raw, primitive terror, the paralyzing fear of a person who suddenly watches a buried ghost rise from a sealed grave. Brooke stammered, asking Rachel who she really was, to which Rachel replied with the terrifying serenity of a woman who had waited half her life for this confrontation, stating Brooke already knew the answer. A suffocating silence slammed down upon the luxurious showroom, leaving Lily Edward and Arthur entirely frozen, sensing that a colossal revelation was about to alter their fundamental reality. Brooke stood paralyzed, the leather portfolio gripped so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white, her terrified eyes darting frantically between the typed words on the paper and Rachel's unmoving face. Brooke finally managed to push words past her lips, her voice shattering as she claimed the papers had to be some sort of cruel, elaborate mistake. Rachel did not offer a single word in response, observing her former friend with a profound calmness that had evolved into a monumental patience forged in the fires of decades of silent suffering. Arthur attempted to read the text, but Brooke violently snapped the folder shut, clutching it aggressively against her chest and fiercely telling her husband to step back. Arthur's face flushed with a mixture of anger and extreme bewilderment as he demanded an explanation, but Brooke fiercely shook her head, her fragile, hysterical voice betraying her massive lie. Rachel, knowing the subtle nuances of Brooke's voice better than anyone else in the world, realized the perfect moment had finally arrived for absolute, unavoidable truth. Rachel turned her gaze slightly and politely asked Edward to lock the front doors of the boutique and close the heavy velvet curtains, stating the impending conversation was not meant for the public. Edward gave a solemn nod and walked toward the entrance, flipping the brass sign and pulling the thick curtains, while Lily remained rooted behind the counter, her eyes wide with shock. Rachel walked gracefully toward a quiet alcove in the corner of the showroom, seating herself with perfect posture and inviting Brooke to sit across from her with a commanding gesture. Rachel dropped the formal retail language entirely, speaking to Brooke with a chilling, familiar intimacy, stating that it was time for them to finally have a conversation after decades of silence. Brooke's massive pride screamed at her to refuse, but her trembling legs absolutely refused to follow the commands of her arrogance, forcing her to collapse into the velvet chair. Arthur remained standing, looking between the two women in utter bewilderment, feeling as though the solid marble floor was shifting violently beneath his expensive shoes. Exhausted and terrified, he pleaded with the room, begging someone to explain what was happening. Rachel slowly lifted her eyes to meet Arthur's desperate gaze, her expression softening into genuine compassion before addressing him in a calm, steady voice. She reminded him that he had entered the boutique desperately seeking a meeting with the owner of the holding company, the exact person he needed to save his collapsing real estate empire. Arthur froze completely, his eyes widening in profound shock, as he stammered, asking how this seemingly ordinary retail employee could possibly know the highly confidential details of his corporate crisis. Rachel plainly stated she possessed that knowledge because she was, in fact, the elusive director he had been desperately searching for. A sharp gasp escaped Lily's lips, and over by the locked front doors, Edward slowly closed his eyes, releasing a long, quiet breath as a monumental secret was finally lifted. Rachel formally introduced herself as Rachel Vance, the sole founder and absolute owner of Maison Orchid, confirming her holding company possessed the exact contract his Apex group desperately needed. Arthur brought a trembling hand to his forehead, his mind spinning wildly out of control as he realized the woman his wife had just publicly humiliated held his entire future in her hands. Arthur choked out a whisper, asking his wife what she had done, but Brooke was completely deaf to his despair, her terrified eyes remaining entirely locked on Rachel's face. The untouchable Beverly Hills socialite was entirely gone. In her place sat a broken girl who had grown up much too fast and deliberately burned every bridge to her past. Brooke whispered in a hollow voice, telling Rachel she was supposed to have stayed behind in the dirt, trapped forever in that miserable, forgotten slum. A tiny, incredibly sad smile touched Rachel's mouth as she softly agreed, confirming she had indeed stayed behind in that desperate neighborhood, scrubbing floors and sewing cheap hems for pennies. Rachel stated she stayed behind while Brooke ran away, changing her name and erasing her history to become someone else entirely. Arthur stared down at his trembling wife, feeling as though he was looking at a complete stranger, and interrupted the tense exchange to ask what neighborhood Rachel was talking about. He recounted the personal history Brooke had fed him for years, that she was born into a wealthy aristocratic family, and had only lost her inheritance due to a tragic mistake. Rachel finished the story for him, admitting the fake backstory was a beautifully constructed lie that the two of them had invented together many decades ago. They were nothing more than two starving girls with massive dreams and absolutely nothing to lose when they lived in a brutal, forgotten sector of Los Angeles. Brooke squeezed her eyes shut, unable to stop two heavy tears from escaping and rolling down her perfectly powdered cheeks. Rachel turned her attention back to Arthur, deciding it was time to unravel the entire truth, explaining that she and his wife had met when they were practically children. They lived in a desperate neighborhood where clean water was a luxury, and families lived behind walls built from scavenged scraps of wood and rusted metal. While Rachel cleaned corporate offices during the graveyard shift, Brooke survived by selling cheap flowers to angry drivers at busy traffic lights, eventually securing a lowly apprenticeship in a cramped tailor shop. They were completely inseparable, bound by the trauma of absolute poverty, sharing a single slice of stale bread and huddling beneath a single thin blanket during the freezing winter nights. Rachel's voice wavered as she confessed Brooke had been her absolute best friend, the only family she had in the entire world, besides her chronically ill mother. Standing quietly behind the counter, Lily felt hot tears streaming continuously down her cheeks, while Edward gripped the edge of the heavy velvet curtain, biting his bottom lip fiercely. Rachel recalled how the two young girls used to dream together in the dark, with Rachel dreaming of opening her own magnificent fashion house by drawing brilliant designs on discarded paper napkins. Brooke's dream, however, was simply to escape the suffocating grip of poverty, swearing that one day she would become a powerful, wealthy woman whom no one could look down upon. Arthur listened in total stunned silence, absorbing the reality that every single word his wife had ever told him about her past was a calculated, desperate lie. Rachel's voice grew significantly quieter, adopting the careful tone of someone gently touching a severe, unhealed wound. Rachel explained that one day a miraculous opportunity presented itself when an immensely powerful fashion designer came to their forgotten neighborhood searching for a single young apprentice. He promised to train this girl, offering her the golden key to the elite world they had only dared to dream about. But he offered only a single position. The opportunity of a lifetime was presented to both girls, forcing them to make an impossible choice about who would leave the slums and who would be left behind. Rachel explained that leaving was an absolute impossibility for her because her beloved mother had fallen severely ill, and she refused to abandon a dying woman to chase selfish dreams. With a breaking heart, she told her best friend to take the golden opportunity, asking only for one promise in return, that Brooke would remember the girl left behind. Brooke had sworn upon her life to return, hugging Rachel tightly and weeping passionately, promising she would never forget her roots, and that they would open their shared fashion house together. Rachel let the silence stretch out before delivering the final crushing blow, stating, her voice hollow with ancient grief, that Brooke never returned. She never wrote a single letter, never sent a message, and vanished into the glamorous elite society as if Rachel and the slums had never existed. When the brutal winter arrived, Rachel's mother finally succumbed to her illness, leaving Rachel entirely alone to bury her mother in a cheap, unmarked grave. Hearing the devastating truth spoken aloud, Brooke broke down entirely, hiding her tear-soaked face in her trembling hands and crying out that she simply could not go back. Brooke confessed her absolute terror, believing that if she returned to that impoverished neighborhood, the poverty would swallow her whole, again forcing her to sever every tie to her past. Rachel nodded slowly, honestly, admitting that for many dark years, she had hated Brooke with every ounce of strength in her soul. However, Rachel realized that Brooke had not merely abandoned a friend. Brooke had completely abandoned herself, ruthlessly murdering the kind, generous girl who sold flowers at the traffic lights. Arthur's legs finally gave out, collapsing heavily into the velvet chair, his eyes staring blankly at the marble floor as he comprehended the terrifying foundation of his marriage. He realized his wife's visceral disgust for working-class people was not born of superiority, but of paralyzing fear, terrified they served as a constant mirror reflecting the impoverished girl she used to be. Moving with a slow, deliberate grace, Rachel stood up from her chair, walked over to the weeping woman, and gently dropped to her knees on the marble floor. She reached out and firmly grasped Brooke's trembling hands, commanding her to look her in the eyes with an overwhelming, unearthly sweetness. Brooke slowly lifted her ruined face, entirely stripped of her protective aristocratic mask, as Rachel stated clearly that she had not orchestrated this meeting to destroy Brooke's life. Rachel acknowledged the legal documents inside the folder contained the power to instantly annihilate Arthur's corporate empire, but she clarified that vengeance was not her goal. She spoke directly to Brooke's fractured soul, explaining that the immense psychological pain Brooke carried could never be cured by inflicting humiliation upon innocent people. Rachel insisted the only path to true healing required Brooke to finally confront the person she had been running from. Brooke's weeping intensified into an uncontrollable deluge of emotion, the profound cleansing tears of a thick sheet of ice finally breaking apart after decades of being frozen solid. In that exact moment, Arthur, still slumped in his chair, slowly glanced up at the large brass clock mounted on the boutique's wall, and then turned his tired eyes toward Rachel. A profound shift had occurred within the defeated tycoon's mind, his panicked thoughts no longer consumed by the impending collapse of the Apex Group. A deeply buried, rotting secret that had been slowly consuming his conscience for decades clawed its way to the surface, and he announced that there was a crucial piece of the puzzle missing. Arthur confessed his massive corporate empire was collapsing as a direct karmic consequence of a horrific decision he had made many years ago regarding their old neighborhood. Arthur aggressively rubbed his hands across his exhausted face, recounting his youth as a desperately ambitious developer trying to build his real estate empire from absolutely nothing. He explained the grueling process of securing investments to purchase an enormous piece of land located in a forgotten sector of the city, buying it for pennies to construct massive towers. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together in Rachel's mind, her legendary composure finally cracking as she demanded the exact location of the land he had purchased. Arthur confirmed her worst fear: the land he bought was their exact neighborhood, and to construct his first gleaming skyscraper, he had to completely clear the entire plot. He explained that required the aggressive eviction of hundreds of desperate families, bulldozing the humble homes and the tiny tailor shop where the girls had started. Arthur confessed the evictions were entirely legal, backed by municipal paperwork, but morally he knew he was obliterating the only safe haven those families possessed. He admitted that for decades he had repeatedly lied to himself, using the hollow excuse of inevitable urban progress to justify his brutal actions. Brooke stared at her husband with her mouth slightly open, asking if he was the man responsible for demolishing the specific tailor shop where she and Rachel had shared their earliest dreams. Arthur gave a single, slow nod of confirmation, leaving Rachel feeling as though the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. Rachel's voice shook with a dark, terrifying intensity as she told Arthur that because of his eviction, she and her sick mother were thrown onto the street into a freezing room. Rachel stated with absolute certainty that the horrible environment had rapidly accelerated her mother's painful death, causing Arthur to hang his head in total shame. Arthur choked out a pathetic apology, revealing that among all the people he had evicted, there was one specific person he had never been able to erase from his nightmares. He explained that on the day before the final demolition, a desperate, impoverished woman with hands severely scarred by hard labor walked into his corporate office. She pleaded with him to halt the destruction, explaining she was terminally ill and that her only concern in the world was the future of her young daughter. Arthur's voice broke completely as he recalled the mother begging for enough time for her daughter, a brilliant artist with golden hands, to find a safe place to stand. Arthur confessed the darkest moment of his life. He looked the dying mother in the eye and coldly stated that progress waits for no one throwing her out. Rachel stopped breathing entirely, the impenetrable shell of perfect composure completely shattering, as she asked Arthur to repeat the exact words the dying woman had used. Arthur quoted the woman, recalling her saying her daughter had golden hands, causing the entire universe to stop spinning for Rachel, because those were her mother's exact words. Rachel declared, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a final sentence, that the woman he threw out of his office was her own mother. Arthur violently stumbled backward, muttering it was absolutely impossible. But Rachel repeated the devastating truth, her tears flowing freely as she screamed at him for snatching away a dying woman's hope. Rachel pointed a shaking finger at the opulent surroundings, declaring the most brutal irony: the impossible dream her mother had begged him to protect had actually come true. Arthur dropped heavily to his knees, completely disintegrating in the face of the horrifying truth, begging for a forgiveness he explicitly admitted he did not deserve. Rachel stared down at the kneeling billionaire, her heart tearing into two warring factions, holding the power of absolute justice in one hand and her mother's sacred memory in the other. She openly confessed a massive part of her soul desperately wanted Arthur to lose everything, but the gentle part of her heart planted by her mother was currently paralyzed. Right at that agonizing crossroads of decision, the oppressive silence was shattered by the sharp, demanding ring of Arthur's mobile phone. Arthur slowly pulled his phone from his pocket, the tiny bit of color left in his face vanishing entirely as he muttered that he had to answer the call from the main corporate bank. Rachel watched in silence as the broken man answered, with violently shaking hands, arguing frantically that they could not legally advance the deadline to leave him completely bankrupt. When Arthur finally lowered the phone, his eyes were dead. He announced the bank had executed the massive debt ahead of schedule, stripping him of every single asset he owned. He revealed there was one final terrifying fact he had only just discovered. The massive debt was not owned by a normal bank, but controlled by a specific individual they knew well. Arthur swallowed a dry lump in his throat, whispering the name Oliver Davies, causing the name to drop into the silent room like a massive block of concrete. Brooke violently shot to her feet, her face drained of blood, her hands shaking with the violent tremor of a trauma survivor hearing the name of their absolute worst nightmare. Rachel's blood also ran freezing cold, recognizing the name of the immensely powerful fashion designer who had stolen Brooke away from the slums decades ago. Oliver Davies had mutated into a terrifying corporate titan whose investment fund aggressively devoured vulnerable companies with cold, calculated precision. Rachel realized Oliver had intentionally purchased Arthur's massive corporate debt, keeping the Apex Group alive just long enough to spring a lethal trap specifically targeted at Maison Orchid. Arthur confessed that Oliver wanted Rachel's life's work, weaponizing Arthur's massive financial desperation solely to force a hostile takeover of the boutique. The luxurious showroom was instantly plunged into a freezing, unnatural cold as Rachel pieced the horrifying puzzle together, stating Oliver had deliberately orchestrated the entire scenario. Brooke backed away, leaning heavily against a marble column, hyperventilating before suddenly beginning to speak, stripping away her final arrogant persona. Brooke confessed she knew exactly the kind of monster Oliver Davies was, having lived as his terrified prisoner for years after he tore her away from the slums. She revealed that his generosity was actually a terrifying cage, using her beauty to manipulate wealthy men, and even her marriage to Arthur was permitted only for future corporate leverage. Rachel's burning rage against Brooke dissolved into a deep empathy, realizing Brooke constantly humiliated workers not out of shame, but out of absolute paralyzing terror of Oliver. Rachel's mind raced as she faced the impossible dilemma to save Arthur. She would have to surrender her mother's dream to the monster who stole her best friend. For a brief second, she genuinely wanted to surrender, but she remembered her mother's exact words about her golden hands and the unshakable moral spine she inherited. Rachel's expression transformed into that of a fierce warrior declaring that Oliver had made one colossal, fatal miscalculation in his arrogant game of corporate manipulation. Rachel picked up the heavy leather portfolio, declaring Oliver never calculated that the two women he had mentally destroyed decades ago would ever stand together in the same room. Rachel extended her hand to Brooke, an undeniable offer of absolute truce, noting that the folder contained the highly illegal, deeply buried secrets of Oliver Davies's past. Rachel revealed the folder contained the original financial ledgers and hidden signatures proving Oliver secretly funded the brutal demolition project that built Arthur's empire and destroyed their families. Rachel proudly declared she possessed the exact documents required to send Oliver Davies to federal prison, causing the luxurious showroom to crackle with an intense electric silence. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the quiet as three aggressive knocks struck the heavy glass door at the front entrance of the boutique. Edward pulled back the velvet curtain, his terrified eyes communicating the disastrous news that the devil himself had arrived, prompting him to unlock the brass deadbolt. Standing there, perfectly framed by the beautiful Beverly Hills sunset, was Oliver Davies, radiating the dark energy of a predator entirely accustomed to absolute victory. Oliver walked slowly across the expensive marble floor, analyzing Maison Orchid with a sickening mixture of elitist disdain and greedy possession, a cold, lifeless smile plastered across his face. He mockingly greeted Rachel, stating it was a terrible shame her impressive business was about to forcibly change ownership, demanding she sign over the boutique to forgive Arthur's massive debt. Brooke stepped forward, staring directly into Oliver's eyes without bowing her head, fiercely declaring that Oliver never forgives anyone. He only extracts payment. Oliver's fake smile sharpened into a dangerous blade as he mocked her, but Brooke screamed that he violently kidnapped her from her true life, admitting her absolute regret for obeying his toxic commands. Oliver dismissed her emotional breakthrough, slamming a thick legal contract onto the glass counter and commanding Rachel to sign the document to save her pathetic friends. Rachel did not flinch, slowly lifting her eyes from the contract and asking for permission to tell him a quick story before she signed her life away. She described the forgotten Los Angeles neighborhood, the dying mother begging the developer, and dropped the ultimate revelation that Oliver was the shadow investor behind the illegal demolition. Rachel held the heavy leather portfolio high, and for the first time in his entirely privileged life, a genuine shadow of deep, primal fear crossed Oliver Davies's face. She explained the documents were rescued by Edward's brother, promising the massive scandal would instantly destroy the Davies House brand and expose him as a cowardly monster. Oliver demanded to know her price, but Rachel confidently informed him that his belief that everything could be purchased was his ultimate fatal flaw. Rachel tore Oliver's takeover contract in half and refused to surrender, demanding that he erase Arthur's debts and free Brooke, or she would expose his secrets to the press. Cornered, Oliver hinted that Rachel's dying mother had once offered Arthur something precious to save their home before leaving. Arthur then confessed that Rachel's mother had given him her worn wooden sewing box containing her life savings, but he cruelly accepted it, despite knowing the demolition would proceed. Overcome with guilt, he returned the box, allowing Rachel to rediscover her mother's treasured belongings and a heartfelt note encouraging her to trust her talent, ignore class prejudice, and help those in need. Reading the message erased Rachel's desire for revenge and inspired her to embrace compassion instead. The next day, Oliver launched another public attack by buying the debts of major fabric suppliers and threatening Rachel's boutique in front of the media. However, Arthur and Brooke arrived with new supply agreements from independent textile partners, ruining Oliver's scheme. Rachel then used the spotlight to announce the Golden Hands Foundation, pledging her fortune to build a design school and provide scholarships for disadvantaged young people on the land where her old neighborhood once stood. As journalists applauded and Oliver retreated in humiliation, Rachel proved that forgiveness and generosity are stronger than vengeance. Her journey showed that true wealth lies not in power or money, but in using painful experiences to uplift others and leave behind a legacy of compassion, dignity, and hope.